My name is Commissioner Frank Avila, and the name of our show today is the Titanic, the Irish ship, the Irish experience. And as my guest, I have Jessica McCann, and Jessica is the Educational Programming and Event Coordinator, Historian, and Event Program Specialist at the Downers Grove History Museum. Thank you for being on the show, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you.
And Jessica is one of the experts on the Titanic. And you know, Jessica, why the Titanic and why the Irish?
Well, this exhibit started at the St. Charles History Museum when I worked there, and we were giving an exhibit on the roots to St. Charles because there was a St. Charles survivor, but I saw a bigger story here and knew about the Irish roots of the Titanic, and so I took the opportunity to create this program and answer that question for you.
Well, let's hear your program, Jessica.
So, good afternoon, everyone. As Frank said, I am Jessica McCann. I am going to give a talk on the Irish ship and the Irish experience. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the social impact the Titanic had. And in order to do that, I have to establish a strong foundation for the prejudices in Ireland and how they arose. In order to do that, I'm going to give an overview of the religious tensions and how they came about. In Ireland, while these issues are extremely convoluted, it can be argued that at the root of the issue is nationalism. So, what is nationalism and why is it so important? According to the Oxford Dictionary, we can define nationalism as identification with one's own nation and support for its interest, specifically in relation to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. In this instance, it would be England versus Ireland, which then leads to Protestant versus Catholic. Nationalism in Ireland led to a series of rebellions, a few of which were Wolfe Tone's Rebellion in 1791, which sparked two more rebellions under the United Irishmen in 1796 and in 1798. These rebellions and the frequency at which they were occurring did not help to alleviate the tensions. In fact, they made things worse until the two groups started othering the opposing side. The Act of Union was forced upon Ireland in 1800 by the English government, and as a result, a separate parliament was established in Dublin. This enforced a policy of Protestant-only members serving on Parliament. This is extremely important because it meant that no Irish Catholics were allowed to participate in government. And anyone who was Protestant had ties directly back to England. So now we have these two groups that are creating a divide and defining themselves in opposition to the other. Emmett's rebellion was a reaction to this. Emmett's rebellion took place on the 23rd of July in 1803. His plan was to take Dublin Castle by force, which was the center of British administration in Ireland. But he did not have enough people or support and interest in the cause. Additionally, he relied too heavily on French support, as did many other rebellions at the time. He thought that a dramatic gesture would spark an uprising, and the result was ineffective. If we jump ahead by only about 40 years, we land in the famine. The Irish famine played a huge role in creating a bigger divide, not only between England and Ireland, but between Protestant Irish, who considered themselves to be British before Irish, and also between the Catholic Irish. References to the Irish character were made by the London Times during the famine, and they posed the argument that the Irish Catholics, who were impacted most by the famine, did not have the work ethic of their Protestant neighbors in Belfast and Ulster. Belfast is where the Titanic is later going to be built. So one must ask, why was there no famine in Ulster? Sources like the Times claim that it was because of the Protestant work ethic. The truth has more to do with arable land and accesses to resources such as fishing. By today's standards, we would classify this argument as victim blaming. The argument posed by the Times shines a light on the abuse and prejudice the Catholic Irish faced during the tragic event, as well as the propaganda used to assist furthering the sectarian divide. Those who were Irish were impoverished. Those who were still able to leave in some way were sent to America. This usually occurred if you already had family who had settled in America, or if you had desirable land that could be sold to an English landlord for pasture. The most destitute were the million that died. Those who were 40-shilling freeholders, which was not the majority of the population, and had met this annual income of 40 shillings and owned and not rented their property, survived the famine. The famine effectively liquidated the poor in Ireland. All that was left was the middling rank and the elite. This created an enormous change to Irish society because the poorest members of its society had been discharged. This leads to animosity on both sides. The average British citizen was starkly unaware of the significant impact of the famine itself. This was due in part to the fact that it was not directly impacting the lives of those persons in London. If these injustices were to have played out in London or were to have been seen by them, would the famine have played out differently? Or was the liberal economic theory of the time simply too progressive, leading to the problematic solution of work relief? Disdain for the Irish played a role in the type of help that was provided. The question can be posed, if this had occurred to the average British citizen, would the type of work relief, at the least, have been more conducive to the physical state of its people? The tensions between Protestants and Catholics persisted into the early 20th century, and it fueled the prejudices embedded in class structure. This begs the question, was the British government partially responsible for perpetrating the devastating results of the famine? I will come back to those tensions later, specifically when it comes to the working conditions for these two groups while building the Titanic. As I had previously alluded to, Belfast was and still is a predominantly Protestant and wealthy area. The economy of Belfast was initially built on trade through Belfast Harbour, which contributed to the stable development, particularly when it came to shipbuilding. In the beginning of the 20th century in Belfast, it was home to the world's largest shipyard. That, of course, is Harland and Wolff. There were 3 ships built under the White Star Line: the Britannic, which was originally named the Gigantic and was then later changed, the Olympic, and of course the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was actually owned by an American, however. The ship was registered as a British ship, but was owned by John Pierpont, or J.P. Morgan. His company was controlling the trust and retained ownership of the White Star Line, which is the company that built the ship. He also owned U.S. Steel, General Electric, and the global financial services firm J.P. Morgan Chase, which is what most of us think of when we hear the name today. Charlotte Brennan is one of the women who actually was able to work during this time, and she was a 20-year-old secretary at Harland and Wolff in the drafting office. She was employed during the construction of the Titanic, and due to her job, she was able to work in close proximity with the shipyard. She had the ability to take photographs of the construction and of the launch of the Titanic. On May 31st, she was given a VIP ticket to the launch, and this gave her direct access to an exclusive box set aside for Harland and Wolff and White Star Line employees. After the sinking of the Titanic, she kept one of the tickets as a memento. And she wrote a small note on the back regarding the sinking, which stated, "Launched 31st of May, 1911. Left Belfast 2nd of April, 1912. Sailed on her maiden voyage on the 10th of April, 1912. Struck an iceberg at 11:45 on the 14th of April, 1912. Sank with the loss of over 1,000 lives at 2:20 a.m., 15th April, 1912. As time moved on after the sinking, women did become more involved in the industry. One such lady was none other than Lady Margaret Peary. She was another influential woman during the construction of the Titanic as Lord Peary's wife, and she was known to take quite an interest in his work involving the Titanic. After her husband's death in 1924, she was appointed the president of Harland and Wolff, which was a position specifically created for her. Harland and Wolff itself was founded in 1861 by Edward James Harland and Gustav Wilhelm Wolff. Harland and Wolff is known for the construction of the RMS Titanic and 70 other ships for the White Star Line. During its heyday, the shipyard of Harland and Wolff had built the largest and most powerful ships. The shipyard was and still is located in Belfast. The initial concept for the Titanic actually began in 1907, and the goal was to create a state-of-the-art, no expense spared luxury ship. There was immense attention paid to the detail, especially in regards to the amenities for the first class. There were things that had never been seen before, such as a heated pool, palm trees, a workout room. The language used in marketing this ship was very intentional. Everything about the Titanic oozed luxury and excitement. When it came to the working conditions, however, the crew felt a little less luxurious. For example, Catholic Irish workers were largely discriminated against. No Catholics were a part of the 22 men drafting section for the ship. There were also no Catholics in the management levels of the ship. And the majority of the crew was Protestant. Those who were Catholics and were hired were severely mistreated on the job. There are a number of accounts of Catholic abuse during the construction. For example, Protestant members were said to have been reported dropping hammers on the heads of their Catholic workers from below. I'm going to pause here for a minute and tell you a story about a man named Samuel J. Scott. And in 1910, he was 15 years old. Sam worked as a catch boy on the construction of Ship 401, which is better known to us as the RMS Titanic. On one afternoon, it was Wednesday, April 20th, 1910, Sam was working on the ship, and he was climbing up a ladder when he missed his footing, and he fell. Nobody saw him fall. He was found by a riveter who saw him on the ground later that day. Sam had fractured his skull and died on impact. This 15-year-old boy was the first death to be recorded. Others would soon follow, such as John Kelly, who was a 19-year-old heater boy. He died in a similar way, also accidentally fell from Ship 401. He was at work at Queen's Island on the 23rd of June, 1910. He, however, did not die on impact. He died of shock following his injuries. William Clark was a 27-year-old driller who died of bronchopneumonia on November 7th, 1910. That was 2 days after his fall from staging. James Dobbin was a shipwright, and the coroner's report stated that his death on the 2nd of June was to be from shock and hemorrhage following the fracture of his pelvis. James was 43 years old when he died. He had a 17-year-old son and a wife who were more than likely present during the time of his injury, as many people had gathered to watch the ship depart for one of its trials. James was crushed by a timber strut as the ship made its way out to voyage. The last of these stories I will tell you is that of Robert James Murphy. Murphy was a riveter taken in an ambulance to the Royal Victoria Hospital. It was discovered that he had suffered from a fracture to the base of his skull, and he died sometime after admission. What makes this accident a particularly sad one is the fact that he was the son of a deceased man who was fatally injured while working on the Olympic. The story of his death was published in the Belfast Newsletter on Wednesday, the 14th of June, 1911. 8 Harland and Wolff workers were killed during the construction. 5 have been identified, all of which were from Belfast. In addition to these fatalities, there were 28 serious accidents and 218 minor accidents recorded by the firm. The Titanic carried many immigrants headed from Europe to America. These immigrants were mostly third-class passengers, and they died in far greater numbers than their first and second-class passenger counterparts, which were on the upper decks. The American dream was alive and well among these cheerful emigrating steerage passengers. They were leaving their homes with essentially everything they owned and the clothing on their backs. This was the biggest decision of their lives. Many scrimped and saved and borrowed to buy these third-class tickets aboard the Titanic. A third-class ticket cost roughly $15 to $40 at the time, which is the equivalent to $350 to $900 today. The majority of the tickets bought were by the third class, even though they marketed the ship toward a more elite audience. There were 120 Irish passengers in the third class demographic, making up that percentage of the ship. When it came to the accommodations, the third class was not hurting in terms of luxury for what was common for third class passengers. The stark differences would be seen in first class to second class, where there would be these grand staircases, and then what we would typically see now in a hotel today versus the third class would be going down into your basement. They function as stairs, so they work. But when we look at the ship structure itself, we can see how it mirrors the class system. Each tier of ticket was associated with a class. These classes ranked from top to bottom in society and are thusly placed in those levels physically aboard the ship. The same restrictions in society exist aboard the ship. The third class was restricted to the third class only areas, and they had no way to navigate the upper decks, which means when the ship hit the iceberg, as we all know it does, they were previously restricted to these areas and didn't know how to quickly and effectively get to safety. This systematic othering causes serious problems, such as compartmentalization of people as concepts based on their class. This separation creates a shift in priorities once the realization of the ship's sinking is evident. Due in large part to the rapid growth of steerage passengers on the big four liners of the 1890s, the Titanic is tied to the third class in a way that cannot be ignored. The fact of the matter is that there were the most number of people in the third class, and yet their tickets, which were the cheapest, did sell the greatest number. And these third class passengers were expendable and largely unknown and died in the greatest numbers as well. When the ship strikes the iceberg, no one is under any real duress. No one believes that the ship is going to sink or that there is any danger. The Titanic is an enormous, high-tech ship that underwent multiple tests and trial runs. No one other than the crew is aware that there is any real danger. When it was finally decided to inform the others of the danger, the third class was the last to receive the message. And thus, they had the least amount of time to make it to safety, in addition to not knowing how to navigate the upper decks. Not only that, but there were not an adequate number of lifeboats, as we all know now. This led to panic, but it also led to the intensification of discrimination brought on by othering. Each group is a means to justify securing spots on lifeboats and inhibiting others from doing the same. When it comes to women and children, though we might think now getting on a lifeboat is a no-brainer to get on the lifeboat. Getting on a lifeboat was a choice that had to be made. Some women froze in fear. Picture being on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's freezing cold, and all of the lights are out, and it's pitch black, and you can't see anything, but you can hear the screams all around you. There is no better opportunity or condition for you to freeze, for panic to set in, for shock to set in. But this isn't what I mean when I say that it was a choice. What I mean is that surviving the sinking as a woman in 1912 was only the beginning. As a woman in 1912, you were the property of your husband. If you were a third-class woman, your husband was probably not getting off of that ship. And if you did, what comes next? And if you have kids, you need to take care of them. And all of your belongings went down with that ship. All of your money, all of your papers proving who you are. You now have no identification and no means to take care of yourself. And you're going to be grieving the loss of your husband, which no matter which case or class you fall into, you had to make that decision. And many women, even in the first class, chose to go down with the ship as opposed to getting on a lifeboat and separating their families. Steerage passengers, or the third-class passengers, aware of the situation, were still not out of danger. Per Kate Gilna, who was a steerage passenger, she was barred by the crew to prevent access to the upper deck. She and her friends, Kate Mullen and Kate Murphy, were rescued by Jim Farrell, a man from their own county in Longford. He is said to have stated, "Great God, man, open up the gates and let the girls through." Surprisingly, the man opened up the gates, but Jim himself perished. His body was one of the few recovered from the North Atlantic on April 24th, 1912. That is 4 days later. Kate found herself alone on the second-class promenade with no idea how to reach the boats. The deck was deserted except for a single man leaning against a rail, who was said to have allowed her to stand on his shoulders and helped her up to the upper deck. When she finally reached the deck, lifeboat number 16 was just making its way down. She was warned off by a man saying there was no more room on the boat. "But I want to go with my sister," is what a young woman is reported to have yelled. And this stranger saved her life as she was let on to lifeboat number 16, and her friends Kate Murphy and Margaret made it to safety by means of lifeboat number 15, which was leaving on the other side of the ship at the same time. This boat, lifeboat number 15, carried about 60 women and children. The Carpathia is the ship that the survivors were able to get onto. The Carpathia itself arrived in New York, picking up the Titanic survivors between 4 and 6 a.m. These rescued steerage passengers were spared the Ellis Island ordeal. They were alternatively interviewed aboard the Carpathia by immigration officials. One Irish woman was asked whether she had her emigration card, to which her response was that she did not have her immigration card, and she was lucky to have her life. Another third-class passenger, Dan Buckley, was one of only 3 third-class passengers to testify before the Smith Committee. He also described the difficulty steerage passengers faced when attempting to go to the boat deck. He stated that the crew members threw a man ahead of him down the stairs and started locking the gates and fled. The man who was thrown is said to have picked himself up and smashed the lock so that Buckley and the other steerage passengers could get up to the decks. It appears that Buckley may have left in lifeboat number 4, which was the last boat to leave the Titanic, at approximately 1:55 a.m. He threw a woman's shawl over his head and jumped into the boat. Ellen Shine O'Callaghan was the grandmother of the New York City Speaker Christine Quinn. O'Callaghan was the longest living Irish survivor of the Titanic. She died in 1993 at the age of 101. Ellen also spoke of the ruthless practices of the crew manning the lifeboats. There have been 2 versions of her story that have circulated through the newspapers during the media frenzy that followed the tragedy. In one version, she is said to have described 4 men from 3rd class who made their way to a lifeboat but were forcibly removed from the boat by officers. In the other version of her story, these 4 men were shot and their bodies were thrown overboard into the Atlantic. Unfortunately, it is impossible for us to know which of these 2 versions are true. Some things are simply lost to history. There is a story of an Ellis Island interview with Margaret Danby. She was a young woman from County Sligo who was reciting the rosary. When a reporter asked if she was praying the rosary for herself, her response was to say, "No, I never thought of myself, only for those cries I heard in the water." She lost 4 friends as a result of the ship sinking. When it comes to survivor statistics, the loss of women passengers in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd class are drastically different. 4 out of 123 women had perished in 1st class. 3 of those women perished by choice. They chose to stay with their husbands. When we get to the 2nd class, 15 of 93 perished. That's 16% of women. But when we get to the 3rd class, 81 out of 179 women went down with the ship. That's almost 50%. It's about 45%, a little more. Ren Craig Wade in The Titanic End of a Dream concludes, "Undoubtedly the most barriers were those within the steerage passengers themselves. Years of conditioning as third-class citizens led to many of them giving up hope as soon as a crisis became evident." Accounts like these have helped us to the reasoning of the poor rate of survival among the steerage passengers. The suggestion is made that they did not help themselves. I would argue, in the end, it was a matter of who would share in the limited resources they had available. In the end, it came down to 3 things: class, nationality, and gender. The White Star Line published a roster for those Irish travelers who had boarded in Queenstown. 54 men, 54 women, and 5 children embarked on the journey. Of that assemblage, 45 men, 22 women, and all 5 children perished. When we look at the survival rates, which is important when it comes to the Smith trials, first class, 94% of women survived and 31% of men survived. Second class, 81% of women survived and 10% of men survived. Third class, 47% of women survived and 14% of men survived. When we look at the crew, 87% survived of women and 22% of men survived. that is drastically mirroring the first class. And this did not go unnoticed, which was why the Smith trials occurred. These statistics led to the trials, but the crew of the Titanic was cleared in the official inquiries which took place in Washington and in London. And this occurred because the ship was owned by an American, but was built in the UK. So there had to be two trials going on because it crossed those lines. The high rate of survival and refusal of some of the crew members who were manning the boats to pick up the survivors had been used to argue that the crew put their own welfare first above that of the passengers, especially those in steerage who were left to defend for themselves. Senator William Aldine Smith, who is the chairman and the Senate of the committee that investigated the disaster, and also why we call it the Smith trials, concluded that the small number of steerage survivors was thus due to the fact that they got no definite warning before the ship was really doomed, and most of the boats had already departed by the time they knew there was danger. The news portrayals were highly problematic, and this caused a lot of confusion. One day, newspapers would state that everyone survived, and the next day, they would claim that everyone aboard the ship had perished. While aboard the Carpathia, that was the ship that the survivors had boarded to continue their way to New York, names had been taken down and wires were attempted to be sent out, but most were unsuccessful. This made it extremely difficult for those who had family members aboard the ship to know if their loved ones had survived. One such example is that of Alice Berg Johnson, who was a St. Charles resident, who had purchased a second-class ticket for another ship. She had to exchange it for a third-class ticket due to the price difference. And she traveled to visit her sick grandfather who was dying. He, unfortunately, did not make it until after she had gotten there. So by the time she had arrived, he had already been deceased. But she did have her two children with her, and she took the opportunity to visit family in that time. She came back on the Titanic with her cousin and her two children, and when the ship sank, Alice and her children were lucky enough to make it off of the ship. Her cousin, however, went into shock and went down with the ship. They could not get her on a lifeboat. Despite how much they tried, she froze. Alice's husband was sent a wire informing him that she had perished. So when he received another one 2 days later from New York stating that she was alive and needed him to come and get her, he was confused. And I can't imagine the roller coaster that he and many other people at that time faced, thinking and preparing and trying to wrap your head around the fact that someone you loved and cared about had just died in a tragedy, and then finding out that they're actually alive, and now you need to get from, in this case, Illinois to New York. When it comes to the Titanic and our present issues, systematic othering is still something that we see. And othering is defined as a process of casting a group of people in a role, an other, and establishing one's own identity through the opposition of that other, and vilification of that other. Nationalism is a good example. So the English othered the Irish, and as a result, there was a spark of nationalism, causing the Irish to other the English and define themselves in opposition to each other. Othering is a process that goes beyond scapegoating. It defines the other and it denies the other characteristics of the same. Characteristics such as reason, dignity, love, pride, and ultimately entitlement to human rights. The process of othering is done deliberately by an idea of an other and reinforcing differences, promoting social and political dominance over a group deemed as the other. So the Irish and the English. This is done through propaganda and symbolism. Propaganda can be defined as misrepresentation of facts, arguments, rumors, half-truths, and lies used to influence public opinion. For example, the London Times representation of the Irish famine and use of terms like the Irish character. There is a distinction between difference and otherness. As people, we all have differences, and this is descriptive, whereas otherness is strategic. Otherness describes the distribution of power. When the other is being judged, the emphasis is on what differentiates instead of what connects. Going back to the London Times with the descriptor of the Protestant work ethic, to highlight and invent a difference between the Catholic Irish and the Protestant Irish. The encounter with the other is dominated by preconceptions, which depend on public representations. This means that the media and the government have to play an active role in creating an image and a divide. In essence, this is a marketing strategy. The result is that the other stops being human and is now a concept. The less one group knows about the other, the easier it is to interpret them through these preconceptions. One gains over oversimplifications and stereotypes. When it comes to the Titanic and otherness, it was a prominent theme throughout the Irish experience. From the building of the ship to its sinking, there were layers of otherness, layers of class and religion and nationality and gender. These systems were at work in everyday society, but they were illuminated by the Titanic and its policy. It was common for those in third class to be denied those parts of society. The result is that when they were denied those parts of the ship as well, the result was catastrophic when an issue arose. An extreme example of othering would be Nazi Germany, but we can see some of the patterns in our politics today, especially when it comes to the polarization of America's current political climate. When we think about these social structures, such as class aboard the Titanic, we tend to think in terms of what we deserve. In this case, based on what was purchased, the tier of ticket. With this first class ticket, I'm going to gain access to more amenities and more services and resources. And with the third class ticket, they were gained access to less. And the feeling of justification based on monetary contribution in effect places a value on the lives of those in its society, which is demonstrated when the first class lifeboats were sent out with 12 people in them for the purpose of comfort. The othering of the Irish was done in such a way that it was inclusive, in the sense that it othered the Irish in layers over time systematically. When othering occurs in this way, it leads to a false justification of othering a group of people who now represent a concept. It is the concept that is disliked, not the people. It's what the other symbolizes that the opposing demographic has animosity towards, not the people themselves, but merely what this group has been conditioned to represent them with. To avoid this, we need to be aware of how these systems manifest themselves. We need to acknowledge our own biases and be mindful of our role in these systems. We need to look at how these roles that we play work not only to our disadvantage, but how do they work to our advantage as well? And that's my presentation.
Excellent, Jessica. Why did you pick this topic, the Titanic and the Irish ship and Irish experience?
So I am Irish.
Irish?
With the last name McCann.
McCann, yes.
So I picked this topic because I was doing an exhibit. I actually helped to create these panels and write some of the content for them. And I knew that there was a bigger story here, and I felt drawn and compelled to share that story because there is no Irish museum in Chicago. There is nowhere for people to gain this information unless they seek it out.
I think now you work at the Downers Grove History Museum.
I currently do work at the Downers Grove History Museum. When I was working on this program, however, I was at the St. Charles History Museum, and the director there was nice enough to let me come and pick up these lovely panels that I helped to create and bring them here.
Now you mentioned Margaret Brown.
Yes, I love Margaret Brown.
Now, what impact, again, what did Margaret Brown have during the aftermath of the Titanic sinking?
Margaret Brown is phenomenal, and I love her. She actually was aboard the ship. She was on the Titanic. She was first class, but she was what was considered to be new money. She actually grew up in Missouri. She is American Irish, and she, from the minute that the ship went down, the ship didn't even, everyone was on the Carpathia. It hadn't even landed yet.
Yes.
And she started creating a fund for the second class and third class women and got a group of first class women together to sew blankets and clothing and donate money. And she actually created a committee aboard the Carpathia of first class citizens, and if they were not in the meetings, she would find them. And if you didn't donate to the cause, she wrote your name on a piece of paper and nailed it to the bulletin board. She was very well versed in languages, so she was spending her time as a woman traveler, which is how she ended up on the Titanic. She spent her time communicating with those in third class that didn't speak English and comforting them and finding ways to help them, and actually started a fund after the Carpathia landed. She continued to be politically involved and ran for office, and she is just phenomenal. I could go on about her for days.
And you made a poster board on her.
Yeah, actually there's two of them made on her here. Yeah.
Margaret Brown, huh? Excellent.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Now, you mentioned about the health of the worker impact by their roles. During the construction of the ship, you explained that a lot of people died.
Yeah.
And young lads.
Yeah, a lot of people were injured and a lot of people died. And there were actually, prior to the Titanic even being built, and during the concept in 1907, James Larkin was a man who was doing trying to create a union for the ship workers. Yeah. And there were a lot of, I want to call them union rallies, for lack of a better term. And I think that also played an impact on how they were treated, because there was such animosity around the idea of having a union. And what's interesting is that the Catholics and the Protestants were perfectly fine being in these rallies where they're like, we need more money, which was odd. Yeah. But then when it came to the construction of the Titanic, it wasn't okay again.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I think that especially with roles such as the Black Gang, which is who would work with the coal underneath the ship, those workers particularly, like, their fatality rate of getting out from the underbelly of the ship when things were being locked. I mean,
oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there were children in that. That wasn't just, there were kids that were a part of that as well, like young children that were working those jobs in the third class.
Interesting. Yeah. You know, how about, you mentioned about the material of the ship. Did the material have an impact on?
It did.
Maybe it would have sank regardless, but what did the material impact have on building the ship?
So during the construction of the Titanic, the reason actually for the concept of the Titanic came about as these three ships. It wasn't just the Titanic. It was the Titanic, the Gigantic, and the Olympic. And the Gigantic was later renamed the Britannic. And the reason was that with the Lusitania in Germany and American ships being built, they were building faster and bigger, more luxurious ships. So the idea was, well, we can do this and we can do it better and we can be the leading luxury ship line.
Yeah.
So with these 3 different areas working simultaneously in competition with each other, there was a shortage on materials.
Oh, interesting.
And so because there was a shortage, particularly on steel and rivets, and they started off using very high quality materials. And then towards the middle to the end, they started running out because of the shortage. And that's where an issue arose. And the rivets that they were using were not great quality because there was a shortage on rivets. And in addition to that, they were heating the plates and heating the rivets, but not letting them cool before they put the rivets in because it sped up the production process. Oh. But it also created a gap between the layers and like around where the hole would be for the rivet, so it never fully sealed. So when the Titanic actually struck the iceberg, those rivets popped out. So that's part of it. Additionally, if they would have hit the iceberg head on because of the construction of the ship, it would have caused less damage than trying to veer and not making it in time to veer fully away from the iceberg. So there were a couple of things at play there.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the owner was from the United States, and J.P. Morgan. Is that the same J.P. Morgan now?
It is. Well, I mean, he's not still alive, but it's the same J.P. Morgan.
I mean,
he'd be very old.
But the name.
Yes, it is that J.P. Morgan.
Interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah.
I did see the movie. The Titanic was very. I enjoyed that movie, showing how different classes were struggling to get on the boats.
Yeah, and actually James Cameron did a lot of amazing research for that movie. He actually interviewed Alice Burke Johnson, who was the St. Charles survivor. And he recreated the ship to look exactly like what it would have looked like. So his interpretation of the ship is spot on. So, I mean, there's a lot of things there that were...
Now, the lady that survived, Johnson, did she still live in...
She is no longer living, but her relatives are alive. We did an interview in St. Charles.
Oh, they still live in St. Charles? Oh, interesting.
So we did an interview with the family. I don't believe that they live in St. Charles currently because she actually moved to Elgin, which is right outside of St. Charles. And I'd have to refresh my memory on where the family itself is living currently. But the children survived, and the children went to school, and it was known that they had survived the Titanic, and they were too young to really be able to talk about it, and their mother wouldn't talk about it, which was very common with Titanic survivors. They had PTSD. They didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to forget that it ever happened. And ironically, Ireland did the same thing. They didn't want anyone to know that the Titanic was built there for a long time because it left a mark on their society. And they looked at it as a failing. And it wasn't until recently that they created the Titanic Museum, which is now the most popular museum and tourist attraction in Ireland. So it wasn't until they kind of really owned that and started to talk about it and really address it that it came back full circle.
Now, you work at the Downers Grove History Museum.
Correct.
So if anyone's visiting the museum, they could come and talk to you about the Titanic.
Oh, I would love it. Please do.
And so do you have any other upcoming programs coming? Because your talk was very interesting.
Yeah, I'm actually going to give a shorter version of this for Irish Books, Arts, and Music. And then I was going to be working on some things for Chicago Scots as well, and probably doing a little bit more work with Celtic Women International.
Yeah, yes.
But as of right now, it's just if you would like a program done, I can make the program for you, kind of a thing, because COVID kind of
I know COVID. Yeah, because
put a bump in that.
At the Irish Center,
Yeah.
Every year they have the Irish Book, Art, and Music Festival.
Yep, and I will be presenting for that, and I'm also helping with the Salon for Celtic Women and organizing that and doing the scheduling for that, running in practice times for that, making sure all the technological issues are fine beforehand, because it's going to be virtual this year.
Yeah,
so.
Everything is virtual, but your talk is excellent.
Thank you.
On what you explained about the Titanic, where it was built, the owner, and the different classes.
Yeah, and I know the beginning was a little heavy on Irish history more so, but I feel that to really fully understand why the Irish were treated the way they were treated, you need to understand that divide and how it was created and why. And it doesn't start with the famine, it starts before the famine, but the famine really pushes it along.
That was interesting.
Yeah.
Way where that one fella wanted to start something, and he figures people would get behind him, and no one...
Yeah, and I mean, he wasn't the first one to do that.
Yeah.
Really, England had been trying to kind of dig its claws into Ireland for a while.
Yes.
They had a bunch of kingdoms in Ireland, and King Henry decided that he wanted to try and take control of Ireland, and it just kept reoccurring. They kept trying and trying and trying, and that's when finally the change in religions occurred, and they were like, okay, well now it's not just this, it can be English versus Irish, but Catholic versus Protestant, and if I can get a moral code or an ethic involved, it's easier to pin two groups of people against each other. And there were plantations that were set up where groups of Protestants would be placed there by the monarchy in England. So I mean, and those plantations weren't successful right away. That was something that continuously kept happening over centuries. And Elizabeth was the one who was actually more successful with that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, do you have the same talk at the museum in Downers Grove?
Right now, I'm actually working on kids programming there.
Okay.
And I will be doing other programming as well, but specifically for the museum. So I'll be doing an American Girls program. They're going to have a new American Girl doll that came out.
Yes.
So I'm going to do a program and like a Halloween thing for the kids there, and trying to make that COVID friendly too. So
giving these talks virtually, how have you changed your talks now?
So the one for Celtic women, this is about a 40-minute presentation, give or take. I have to cut it down to 20 minutes.
I see.
And I'll be giving it on Zoom.
And then the Celtic Women is what now? The Celtic Women is an organization?
Mm-hmm. And this will be for IBAM. So,
IBAM. And IBAM is the Irish Book, Art, and Music Festival that the Irish American Heritage Center has every year, and they call it IBAM.
Yes.
IBAM.
So I'll be giving the presentation there through a Zoom link, through Zoom, but I'll be splitting the screen, so you won't really see me, but I have a PowerPoint that goes along with this, so you'll see my PowerPoint, and you'll hear my voice, and you'll see me after for questions, maybe before.
So how long have you been doing this?
Freelance doing this program and programs like it, I would say I've been doing this for about a year to a year and a half. I've done this at the Irish American Heritage Center, Gaelic Park. I've done it for Celtic Women for one of their meetings.
Events, yes.
And then I'll be doing it for IBAM, and I did it here. So I've been doing that for about a year to a year and a half, and I've been in the museum field for about 2 or 3.
So if anyone wants to hear, have you go and give the talk, they could reach you at the museum, the Downers Grove Museum? Yeah,
they could do that, or I have a Facebook page.
A Facebook page?
So they could find me. It's Jessica McCann, Events and Educational Programming and Events Specialist. That's my page on Facebook, and people can find me there.
Yeah. How do you find now with the virtual, with the epidemic going along, are people visiting your museum now? Is it open?
The museum has reopened, so we have some visitors. People were trying to come when it was closed, too, so it's not like there isn't a desire to be there. It's more just trying to schedule that time with people
I see.
and keeping people safe, because it's still our priority, is making sure that everybody is safe.
So it's open then?
It is open,
It's open?
yes.
Now, what kind of exhibits do you have at the Downers Grove Museum?
So the Downers Grove Museum has 3 buildings on the property. There is a barn, there's the 1846 house, which is still kind of under construction. We're showing how houses like that were built.
Yeah.
And then we have the farmhouse. So there's 3 actual buildings that you can go in and view, and it is set up to look like what the people who lived there previously, how they would have lived. And then there's also a garden area. So it's a very large museum, actually. And we have the outline of what a log cabin was that was previously on the property. And yeah, so I mean, it's a couple acres. It's pretty large.
Good. You know, getting back to the Titanic.
Yeah.
The movie that when they made the movie, and because that ship sinking, was that the largest casualty of any ship in history on a passenger side?
At the time, yes. And actually, because of that, there were new policies that were implemented. Yes. And so I'm blanking on the name of the ship, but immediately following that, they set a policy in that you had to have enough lifeboats to cover every single person that was on the ship, and enough life jackets, and all of these things that sound amazing in theory. However, when they're not implemented properly in terms of the structure of the ship itself, you have other issues. It was the Eastland Disaster. So.
Oh yes, the Eastland. That's right here, right?
Yes, it was.
Yes, the Eastland. Oh yes.
Mm-hmm. So everybody went to one end of the ship to wave goodbye, and they didn't realize how much of a goodbye that was going to be, because everybody on that ship perished because it flipped and there wasn't enough time for them to get out. There were people that were below deck. I mean, so that one was eye-opening as well for people. Yes,
and what the court case was in the United States side and on English side. Were they both about the same verdict?
Yes, I think that they communicated with each other also on the matter of how things were going. And the reason for the red tape, again, was because it was owned by an American, funded by an American. But then the shipyard itself and all of the workers were in Ireland.
I see. Well, you know, thank you very much, Jessica McCann.
McCann.
Jessica McCann. I really enjoyed your talk on the Titanic. Very from the start of it to the end of it, how it made a change in our safety measures on traveling.
Yeah.
There.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, a lot of work you put into it. So here's one of the experts on the Titanic.